I feel like Goldilocks. Somebody was sitting on a chair.
They put it up. You can hit the. But watch, you're gonna.
Good. It's always good to get away, isn't it? Families camping.
Yeah. Not camping with family.
Good evening. I call this Iowa City Community School Board meeting on Tuesday, July 9th, 2019 to order. My name is Janet Godwin, and I want to thank those in the audience, those watching on YouTube, and those following on Twitter for joining us tonight. I'll start by introducing those at the table with me. To my right, Superintendent Steve Murley, Directors Ruthina Malone, Phil Hemingway, Lori Rotland. To my left, Paul Ressler, J.P. Clausen, and Kim Colvin, Recording Secretary. The public is reminded that if they wish to speak, they need to complete a speaker form found at the table in the lobby and turn it in. During community comment, persons may speak to the board about topics relevant to the district. All community comment directed at non-agenda items and agenda items shall take place at the beginning of the meeting during the community comment section of the agenda. Before we move into the agenda tonight, I would like to ask that we have a moment of silence and remember Sarah Michael, a talented student in our district preparing to enter Liberty High School this fall, who tragically passed away last week from a sudden health condition. Please take a moment to remember Sarah and send support to her family, friends, classmates, and teachers who are all grieving and trying to come to terms with this tremendous loss. Thank you. We will move into community comment. First up, we have Stephanie Van Heusen, followed by Julie Van Dyke. Van Heusen. Heusen. I did get it right.
Yeah. So I want to thank you all for your serious concern about threats to our school and all the considerations that go into keeping a school and all of the students safe. I'm particularly concerned about several things in the discussion, and one is that we need SROs. I don't think we do need resource officers, law enforcement in the schools. I think if there's drugs in the schools, I think that that's something that the principals can deal with in the way that they deal with problems like that. They always have. That's not a reason to have law enforcement in the schools, nor is it a reason to have drug dogs in the schools. Secondly, I think that we have a really dismal reputation and track record for our actions disproportionately against minority students that harm them throughout their life. And that leads to our threat assessment teams that we have. I'm sure we have those right now in our district, but threat assessment teams are biased based on the lens that people are looking through. Who is it in our district that's going to stand up for students with mental health issues? Who's going to stand up for students that are different, that have peculiar behaviors, that look different, that their parents maybe don't supervise them the way you would supervise your own children? When you do an assessment on a child or a youth to find out if they're dangerous to the school, who is going to do something to help keep that child or that youth connected to the schools? Because we know if we shun them, if we push them out, they are more likely to cause harm than if we keep them in, if we put our wings around them and make sure they get the supports that they need. Right now, we expel students, we suspend students, and we don't provide the help that they need. We make them feel unimportant. We send out emails to the world, letting the world know that that student has done something bad, that they don't belong in our community. We don't do things in a compassionate way in our community, in our district community. We don't use restorative justice like we could. We know our climate really is terrible for many of our students, and these are for the students that you're going to be doing threat assessment, that someone is going to be doing a threat assessment on, that Mr. Murley and his people are going to be doing a threat assessment on. And the climate is not good for these students as it is now. No one speaks right now against Mr. Murley. No one in this district, if they want to keep their job, is going to speak out and say, no, this student deserves a chance and we need to put some supports in. How do I know that? I know that from experience. I know that we can do better. I know a lot about mental health. I know a lot about people that feel isolated from their communities. And I know that these people are not going to get a fair shake in a threat assessment from one of Mr. Murley's machines. Not going to happen.
Thank you, Stephanie. Julie?
So you have a superintendent evaluation today. Does he have his PhD yet? Have you looked at the paper from when he came where he said that he'd had it by the end of the first year he was here and he still doesn't have it? Has anybody actually asked and confirmed how much money we have paid towards his tuition, towards time that he takes off, towards the supplies, towards travel, towards everything that he's giving for that PhD that he still doesn't have? The families that come up here said SROs are great because they're in all of the other comparable school districts in the state of Iowa. Do any of those school districts have superintendents without PhDs? Okay, that's an integrity issue, okay? And that's core, and it's a problem. And the money that we keep throwing at that non-existent PhD is unknown. So I went to school here, kindergarten through first, 8th through 12th. I'm probably the only person in the room that's actually been shot at on school district property. And I'm not sure, but what I'm remembering back is that I had concerns after I took the Alice Fisk training at UI Public Safety because it's stellar. My friend's father was one of the people that was killed by Gang Lu, and I was aware of that and have followed things. And I actually met when I was still speaking with him before he threatened me, with Mr. Murley, and spoke with him and got permission from him to approach the UI Public Safety Department to ask if they would do their Alice Fisk training outside of UI for the school district. This was right before Sandy Hook, pretty much a little bit before Sandy Hook, I think. And he gave me that permission to do the footwork, and I have the documents that show it. I brought that in here. I care about dangerous situations in the schools. SROs aren't going to help. The first time that we had the SRO thing thrown at us with a sudden, oh my God, we've got this grant and we can partner with the city of Iowa City and bring in SROs, They disclosed that each SRO at that time was the equivalent cost of 2.5 teachers or counselors and required a dedicated office. We don't have that money to lose. And the fact of the matter is, when there was a gun out at West High the last time, when Argabright was still there, I believe the police response there was under 2 minutes. We have armed police in any of the schools that we want them here, and they do a great job, and I support what they've done here in my experience. We don't need to pay them to come in here. We don't need to lose that money. The people that are coming up here, and Dan Gable with his big guns, have a problem. And the problem is that they grew up in the same Iowa City that I did. When I went to West High, there were 3 black students there. And one of them was the gym teacher's son. 3. It's not like that anymore, is it? The Southeast Side has accepted and become the homes of many of the people driven out of the projects in Chicago. They don't have anywhere to go. There are people here from St. Louis. And the diversity of our school district is a long way from 3 black students at West High, and they're scared of it. And they think telling us to put SROs is gonna, turn back the hands of time. It's not. This city is just as much, and these schools are just as much the Southeast sides as it is the rich white people over here on the Southeast side, every bit as much. The SROs aren't going to fix anything. What everybody here should be pushing for is for the Iowa City Police Department to immediately reinstate and make better plans for utilization of that Southeast substation. That will help. Putting the cops in the schools isn't going to do anything. None of these shootings, none of this has happened at City High or on our school districts, and it's not really our students. Work with the police department, get that substation reinstated, and address it at a community level. Because I was promised by the man who did the Alice Fisk training that if there is a cop in a school and a gun comes out from a student, that he promised, he said, they will shoot. And they think their kids aren't going to get shot because they're not bad. No, anybody's kids in that hallway are vulnerable to being collateral damage. Don't help them do that.
Thank you, Julie. That concludes community comment this evening. First up is the approval of our agenda this evening. Is there a motion to approve our agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast, and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you, Kim. Next up, consent agenda. Phil, and I think Paul reviewed bills this period.
Yep. I got a chance to look at them yesterday after the playground committee meeting. This period, we had $9.9 million in expenditures, $1.2 million out of the general fund, $5.3 million out of the GO bond. Also, I guess it starts a new trend with how it's reported. It's I've been following the accounts payable for close to 10 years, and so we're changing over to a different format and things that way. So it's going to be a little bit different that way, and there's some Terracon charges again for playground issues, and some legal services that we have that I have some issues with, but everything else looks very good. And that, Paul, if you had anything you wanted to comment on.
Well, I had a couple questions that I presented to Steve, and his team answered. Replacement of some iPads in the district was one of the expenses. And I think all the other questions were answered. So I do agree with Phil that new sheet took a little bit more time to get through, but it'll be good going forward.
But kudos to the team for actually getting the ERP up and running and generating reports from it. I mean, the transition always takes a little time. There's always some rocky bits, but I mean, we're seeing data from the new ERP. That's a big deal. So kudos to the team for that. Thank you, Phil and Paul. Any consent items that directors would like to pull?
I'd like to pull number 11 just for discussion.
Any others?
I move that we approve the consent agenda minus item 11.
Second.
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with Directors Rutland, Ressler, Godwin, Clausen, and Malone voting yea and Director Hemingway voting nay.
Thank you. Paul Avid.
Yeah, just wanted some clarification, and maybe, I don't know if Steve or Matt can answer this, but can you just address what the secondary schools will be doing with Avid going forward? And, you know, looking through this sheet, it's all kind of different what each school is doing, I guess.
Sure. So there's a couple different ways you can approach a secondary model. I think the easiest to talk through is what we've started with at Northwest, and primarily what it is, it's a section that is scheduled into the student's day, and so they go there for support. It could be anything from around note-taking to keeping track of grades and assignments to strategy building for the students. When we talk about executive functioning or any of those types of things, it could talk about registering for classes when they get to high school to pursue interests, to find out what their interests are and to help solicit those things so there's a path towards graduation and post-secondary education. High school is very similar. They'll have that pull-out section that they have a teacher there supporting them to do that. It involves outside of school connections as well. And I think the other piece of it is the school-wide approach, and that's the part where we haven't embarked on yet, but there can also be some school-wide pieces where staff members or teachers commit to, we're all going to commit to the same note-taking strategy, or we're all going to commit to teaching reading, you know, for this portion of time. And so as we get more involved with the Avid process and we have more staff members trained, then those are some of the school-wide approaches that happen. And again, it's kind of to help kids navigate that system of school, right? And so that we're not asking them, you know, when they already interact with 6 or 7 different adults throughout the day, that maybe there's some commonality between that experience. And so that's the ideal, right? That's where the school-wide approach would kick in. But the initial start is a section scheduled into their day, so they're not just reporting to a study hall, that there's a more meaningful experience for them.
So I appreciate that all the secondary schools are now on here, but is there a plan to get elementaries up to that level, and if so, when?
Yeah, so this year you see the 4 buildings that have been involved the last couple of years involved again. We did go out to 2 additional elementaries this year. We need our elementary buildings now to make a commitment. What you can't see behind there is a training commitment after your initial years. Depending on what year you're in, your expenses are greater at the beginning and not at the end. But the 2 buildings that we offered it to felt like they had enough new initiatives on their plate that they asked not to be involved this coming year. Super Kids is an example with the K2 reading implementation of why those buildings didn't go forward.
But the goal is eventually for all of the elementaries and secondary schools to be Avid schools. And so at some point, we're going to have to, I think, make that a priority if that is in fact the goal, to get the benefits of a district implementation, right? So-
Yes, and we are going to have to talk about the cost associated with that as we move forward, because you can see that just the ongoing or recurring cost is up to $3,000 a year right now, whereas before we were thinking roughly $2,500 to $2,800. So that's going to
Yeah.
be over time something that we have to continue to cross that when we get to it.
Yeah, fair enough.
And that's my concern with the whole Avid thing, is, I mean, we can make a standard for note-taking and things ourselves. I mean, schools, when my daughter was at Hoover with Mrs. Wertman, or drawing a blank on Wirtz, was the principal. They had their planners. They had a lot of the things that Avid had. They didn't have the wear your college sweatshirt on Friday thing, but they pushed it, and they pushed it through their students. And I know at the high school level, with Mr. Wilson in chemistry, he pushed notes for his students that my daughter used the same notes when she was at the University of Iowa taking chemistry. So I don't, is this something we have to do this, or is this something that we can do as a district-wide level and save some money?
think that's something we're investigating and investing in. We have Renee Person, who is an IDS over at Kirkwood. She's got a small stipend to help support this work, so she goes and gets additional training. That for us, our avenue would be our monthly IDS principal meetings, where we could take components back to all of our buildings. They wouldn't necessarily have to have the full gamut of training. Again, just going back to having access to the electronic database and materials for the year, that's the $3,000 cost. So, I mean, at some point, that's a bridge we might have to, an avenue that we might have to take given where we're at with cost.
Right, well, and like I say, I think this is something that it's not a secret recipe. We know what's involved and what's required. I think we can do it ourselves.
So I move we approve the Avid agreement as presented.
Second.
Kim, ready to vote?
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with Directors Rotland, Ressler, Godwin, Clausen, and Malone voting yea and Director Hemingway voting nay.
Thank you. Next up, legislative priorities. We had the pamphlet from last year. We can take one thing off the list.
Yes, and
So
I
what
know
do we
that
wanna put in instead?
Yeah, it may feel that this is awfully early in the process, since I just sent you out the summary of the work done in the last legislative session, but just a reminder that one of the things that IASB does is ask us to share with them, not necessarily the language that's found in the paragraphs after the headings, but what our primary areas are, and they try to gather that from all school boards across Iowa, so that helps them in their agenda-setting process. So as we look at this, look at the priorities from last year, you see those 6 that are on there. Obviously, SAVE is one that has been addressed by our legislature. So the question today really is, do you wish to move forward with the 5 that are on there? Are there any new ones that you want to entertain? With a request then that we forward that to the Policy and Governance Committee when they reconvene in the fall. That'll give them time to draft any language that we'd like to see changed and bring that back to the board for review so that we have it ready to go by January. And this is really, again, our opportunity to have input with IASB.
Climate action.
Well,
Just curious, I mean, we've been talking about that a lot. In fact, in part of our draft resolution, it has something in there around engaging with other entities and legislative bodies to try to push forward standards and progress on climate action. So that would be something maybe worthy of discussion.
and I would push for greater career curriculum statewide and request funding for such. College debt is the largest liability in our nation, and we have got to give alternatives to our students other than just pushing that at a state level, and I think that should be a legislative priority.
Another one that I'd bring up is mental health services,
Yeah.
greater funding for mental health in the schools. I feel like that's in my biased opinion, being a social worker, that's like top of the line critical above everything else. If you don't have, if we're not addressing the mental health needs of our students, and it's really hard to be successful with anything else in the school.
Yeah, I would just second that. And my guess would be that that's something we could get a lot of other school boards sort of on board with, especially as they sort of roll out this children's mental health network, just
Right.
to keep that school-based mental health services component in there, because it's a good, we need it, and schools are a good place to sort of have services available to be accessible.
And maybe we could chat with the AEA or, some other entity, whoever's appropriate, to find out what our ask is. Do we want categorical funding for mental health services to be given to the schools directly, or do we want it to be funneled through the AEA? What is the best way to fund that? I don't have that answer, but perhaps they could guide us so that we could get an ask that we could get the other school boards across the state to join in on and really see some movement on.
In addition to those 3, are there any of the 5 that you would not want us to forward to the IASB?
It's hard to take any of those other ones off.
I
Well,
imagine we will probably be the only district asking for the restoration of Chapter 20
Yeah,
again, but
probably.
We'll keep at it.
We'll send these 8 in then as headers to the IASB, and then we'll refer all 8 of them to the P&G committee when they reconvene in the fall. Take a look at
Okay.
those.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Next up, we've got an action item on transfer appeal. The board's stance on these is to choose option 1, which is to take no additional action. Everyone agree with that?
I have a couple questions about that. So I read through the appeal, and there's some information in there that alludes to the fact that there's some mental health issues at play here. And I know in the past, sometimes that's been a reason that we've approved transfers. I know that particularly we talked about that with Liberty, that was an exception. Was that considered in this situation?
It was.
Okay.
Amy, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Okay, and then my second question is, since this child is involved with special education, is there a means to appeal this? So our standard action on these things a lot of times has been to take no action, but many times there's an option to appeal, for example, in the transportation appeals or situations. But in this one, we don't have here any appeal. Can this family appeal this to the AEA if there's an implication that is not intended for the child in regards to special education?
They can't appeal it to the AEA, but they can take it back through the IEP process.
Okay. Do you want to speak to that?
Within the guidelines that the board set for voluntary transfers, there was a special education caveat kind of put in there for students who had been placed in buildings other than their own in order to access programming at some point in time, which could have been this year or in the past. So in essence, if we had already placed a student in a different building, then we were going to go ahead and kind of make good on that placement because that would probably be in the student's best interest. I don't think that is the case here. That is the only provision that the board, put into those guidelines. If there is a concern about us meeting the services of the IEP or something like that, student-specific reasons why a person is, could be requesting a different placement, then we could hear about, I'd be happy to hear about want to hear about any kind of situation where that's happening. I haven't heard that, but in case, if that's true, that we would want to deal with that somehow. I'm not sure if a voluntary transfer would be the right thing, but, maybe. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think what I hear you saying, Steve, is that the family could present this through the IEP process or review, IEP review.
They can bring it to the team, and then the team can have that conversation as part of that regular IEP review.
Sorry. The IEP team would want to discuss any kind of concerns going on with, from the parent's point of view or the student's point of view with services being provided, whether or not we appear to be implementing the services that are already written, or if they're just not sufficient. Those are definitely IEP team decisions. And I would say a lot of times when people might have requested a voluntary transfer, maybe it's indicative of other concerns, and those specific concerns, we want to make sure that the IEP is written properly, and that's the job for the team.
Mm-hmm. So just, in reality, school's not in session right now, so the family would have no means to take any action on that prior to school starting.
Mm-hmm. No,
is there any mechanism that we could put in place to, I'm just trying to give this family another option if they feel they would like to appeal what we're doing.
We have had IEP meetings over the summer, quite a few actually. Scheduling them is sometimes takes a little while because we have to make sure all the right people are at the table. And we don't have teachers on contract, but we can figure out a proper representative even in the summer, and we have and we do all the time. Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you, Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
So if we take no action, that is still available to the family. To do it through the IEP process.
Not to do it through the IEP process. I want to make sure that I'm saying this accurately, that appealing the voluntary transfer doesn't happen through an IEP team, but resolving the concerns that may have led to the request to begin with are the things that we definitely want to keep within the IEP team, because the services are IEP team decisions. So though any kind of concern that may have prompted it, I'm assuming that maybe there was a concern that prompted it, maybe not, but if that is the case, we definitely want to address those things within the IEP team. If it's a matter of just, that a parent feels like the services aren't being provided, that's a conversation with the building principal, and if that resolution doesn't happen then, they could always contact someone in my department. We can look into it more.
And I'm just going to point out that one of the letters that was written by a physician was written by a psychiatrist. I'm not sure how we make those decisions from one situation to the next as to the mental health exception, but point that out.
Amy and I reviewed all of these, some of them multiple times, and we actually often tried to review them in batches, so we had the ability to look across. We did have some legitimate concerns that were expressed. We also had a lot of people that, to be honest with you, didn't like the new attendance areas and were looking for an opportunity to either return to a former school or go to a preferred school. So we tried to look at those, had conversations with building administrator, teachers, with various members of the support team, whether it's special ed or others out there, to really see if we could understand it in depth. We had some with health issues, and so some of them took a long time to review. Like I said, some of them took multiple passes or multiple rounds of correspondence with parents to really try to understand the context of it, and then we tried to make decisions that were uniform across all those that were turned in.
I appreciate the time you put into that. Thank you.
Okay, we are going with option one. Next up, Director Liaison Report. Anything directors would like to comment on?
Well, I did not win this, but it is, my father wanted to make sure it got back to City High. It's the 49 Mississippi Valley Conference Champs Trophy from 1949 for our boys basketball team. My father was part of that team. The team was undefeated in conference play. Mississippi Valley Conference at that time included Davenport, Clinton, Dubuque, Waterloo East, Waterloo West, and 4 Cedar Rapids schools. The team was undefeated in conference play, but they did have 2 losses. They did lose to Davenport in the final sub-state game, which was played at the old field house. It was a close game. My father he didn't remember the score to that one, but they did lose also to Newton on a snowy night when a Clyde Gardner, and I've heard the Clyde Gardner story many times growing up. Clyde Gardner was a big farm boy from Newton that set the U.S. high school record in the discus with a discus throw that hit a school bus. He was a big farm kid, went in there, lost to Newton on a snowy night. He fouled out the City High center, who was 6'5", and they contributed that as part of the reasons for the loss. The snow was so bad on Highway 6 that they had to stay overnight in Newton. This was before Interstate 80. During the season, they practiced at the old field house on a Sunday, and the St. Mary's of California was there to play the University of Iowa, and the 2 coaches agreed to scrimmage each other, the high school team and St. Mary's of California. And I don't know, Al Grady, who was the sports writer for the Press-Citizen at that time, was in attendance and kept score. And City High beat St. Mary's of California 40-38. It was reported on in the Press-Citizen. My father says that they had a All-American on their team, and this is before the three-point shot and everything like that. But he said that the rebounding was at a level he had not had not participated in when they were playing the St. Mary's team, but just something that happens also, and it's interesting that, you know, the high schools and the colleges were using the same facilities. That's something we should look at. I know West Branch, we didn't have a track when I was in school, but we would use the U of I indoor track for our track meets and utilize the outdoor track there. So any collaboration, there's these unique opportunities that happen. But this trophy's going back to City High, and my father said that Jim Stangster gave it to him. So, and the reason is they felt that it might take away from the 47 state championship trophy was the reason. But anyway, it's going back home to City High.
That's great. That's a great piece of history there.
Well, it's the recollections of those things are very vivid.
I just want to make one comment on one of mine. Ruthina and I were able to attend the Inclusive Teacher Awards ceremonies on the 28th, and just congratulations to our district teachers that were awarded those awards.
Thank you. Okay, up next is agenda setting. For the 23rd, we've got a closed session on superintendent evaluation. We've got a board meeting where we have just standard items and nothing beyond a consent agenda at this point. Then let me just quickly hit on what we have already scheduled on work session. We've got for that evening implicit bias evaluation, as well as the presentation of the 2019 through 2022 Comprehensive Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Plan. That's going to be a healthy conversation, but the actual board meeting is super light. I had a couple things that I was looking for updates on. One would be an update on the threat assessment grant process and where we are with that, and any updates that we might be able to share. I'm also curious to see if we can have a conversation around plans for Northwest Junior High School. And maybe that is, I don't know if it's in a board meeting or a work session next meeting or into August, but I know a number of us have toured Northwest and just have questions around what our plans are for that building, and would like to see a board conversation on that occur. A couple other things, depending on how work session goes tonight, we may be having an action on climate resolution at the 23rd, depending on where we land this evening in our conversation. And depending on where we land on the Pearl discussion, we may have an action on that resolution on the 23rd as well. But both of those are depending on what we accomplished in our following work session this evening. So I think we can hold off on putting those on the agenda for sure. But curious, Steve, your thoughts on how we can I think we could just get an update at the board meeting on the threat assessment grant, and maybe given that work session's pretty well full, we have a Northwest Junior High conversation at the board meeting, or do we want to try to do that at the work session?
I think we could do that at the work session, so there's an
Okay.
opportunity to have a conversation, get the administrators in here.
Okay.
I have asked to see if they're both available. I haven't confirmed that yet, but providing that they're both available, then we'd have that opportunity to have
Okay.
them present and get their input.
And luckily, it'll be an early work session, given that the board meeting itself is so short. There's one other thing I wanted to note, that we're planning a board retreat on August 20th, and the agenda is still being developed, but I think a couple things for sure would be around how do we do in our goals for the 2018-19 year, just to kind of close that out, and then also do some goal-setting activity for the 2019-2020 year. And that's been scheduled August 20th, 5 to 7. And we'll get that out on board docs when we get to that point. Anything, other items from directors that you'd like to see?
I have a question on the presentation of the comprehensive equity plan, diversity, equity, and inclusion plan. I know it's in the work session, but I feel it'd be beneficial to have that presentation at the board table, with the documents and everything, everything that's going to be shown. So it's live stream versus recorded?
Sure. I know that Sarah Bruck, who's been leading that work, we actually were hoping to have her in tonight. She had a schedule conflict, and so we had to move her to the 23rd. I'm not sure who she may have invited. This has been a long process for those that have invested their Monday evenings in that this summer. I'm not sure how many of them she planned to invite and whether she planned to have them speak at the meeting. If I could check with her on that first and determine whether or not work session or the board meeting would be more appropriate for either conversation or presentation, and then put it in the appropriate place.
Yeah, that'd be fine. And then the second thing I had is I don't know if we keep it on the checklist, but I did ask about having a deeper discussion about our mental health services at some point.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, and to that end, with our speakers tonight talking about behavior and things like that, yeah, if we could have some discussion on how those two topics kind of correlate and come together. But definitely a discussion on behavior in the schools, I think, would be appropriate. And also, talking with Chase after the playground committee meeting on Monday, I asked to have a discussion on the agenda setting at the last board meeting about the OSHA situation. There's some things we can't talk about, there's some things we can, but just a discussion on what can be shared and what actions the district has taken to just to reassure the public that, you know, we're taking corrective action and that type of a thing. I think that would be, I don't know if it would be a lengthy thing, but is that, you want to speak to that, Chase?
Sure, just briefly. I think to kind of extend on what you said, Phil, I think we can talk about everything. It's just, I think some things would be for the board in a closed session, and there's other things that we could talk about in an open session, just kind of given the nature of it. It's not that we're unwilling to share everything we know about it. I think there's just some things that would be excluded from an open meeting, but we can definitely look at those pieces and have some of that discussion in an open session if that's what the board would like.
Yeah.
Well, I think what we can be transparent about, I think we should, and have that discussion, respecting whistleblower protections and things like that, which, would be.
So on the 23rd?
Sure, I've got that on.
Okay, good. What else?
Are we saying that we're going to talk about mental health and behavior on the 23rd? Or some,
I think we need to plan what that would
Yeah.
look like. I'm sensing.
that seems like a pretty big,
I just want to keep it top
on the
of
radar,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Yeah. Anything else? Hearing none.
We also have on the list to hear about the RAM and the achievement information. I don't know if you are going to have that ready.
We do, we have that in August.
Okay.
Okay, anything else? Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved?
Second.
All in favor? Aye.